Imagine this. A woman is standing at the edge of a coal field in Wales, in the middle of winter, with no money, no church building, no denominational backing, and no plan except one. She would not move until the thing she was carrying caught fire in someone else. She had walked 17 miles to get there. Her shoes were wet through. She had not eaten since the morning before, and nobody knew her name. That is where we begin. Her name was Glenys Maud Bevan. She was born in 1876 in a small village outside Pontypridd, in the south of Wales, the second daughter of a collier, who read his Bible every night by lamplight, and a mother who had memorized most of the Psalms before she was 20. They were not wealthy people. They were not important people. The kind of people the world moves past without noticing. Glenys grew up in a 2-room house with 5 siblings and a sense that something enormous was pressing against the walls of the ordinary. She couldn't name it as a child. She only knew that when her father prayed at the dinner table, the room changed. Something entered. She could feel it the way you feel a shift in pressure before a storm. She was a serious child. Not solemn, serious. There is a difference. Solemn children are performing gravity. Serious children are actually thinking. Glenys was always thinking. She asked questions that embarrassed people. Why does God seem far away on Sundays but closer when no one is watching? Why do we sing the same songs every week but never seem to change? Why does the man at the front of the church look so tired? Her Sunday school teacher once told her that curiosity was a sin when directed at sacred things. Glenys walked home that day and sat under the oak tree behind the house and spoke directly to God for the first time without any borrowed language. She was 9 years old. She said simply, "I don't think that's right, and I think you made me this way on purpose." That prayer was the beginning of everything. She grew into a young woman who worked at the textile mill in town, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, threading bobbins and breathing cotton dust and saving whatever shillings she could. She was unremarkable by any measure the world uses. She had no formal education past the age of 12. She had no connections. She had one friend, a girl named Nesta, who worked beside her on the mill floor and shared her lunch and never once questioned why Glenys spent every spare moment reading. She read everything. Not just scripture, history, geography, letters of the reformers, reports from foreign missions. She read about the Great Awakening. She read about the Methodist revivals and the field preachers who stood on hillsides and watched hardened men weep without understanding why. Something in those accounts would not let her sleep. She began waking before dawn to pray, not because anyone told her to, not because any preacher had laid a method before her and said this is the way. She woke because she couldn't not wake. Something pulled her upright in the dark, and she would kneel on the cold stone floor of her room and stay there until she heard the mill whistle. Her mother, the first time she discovered this, stood in the doorway in silence for a long moment and then said only, "Don't let it make you strange, Glenys. The world is not kind to strange women." Glenys understood what her mother meant. She also understood, even then, that the warning was too late. When she was 22, a revival broke out in a village 30 miles north. She had heard about it from a woman at the market who described scenes that sounded either miraculous or deranged depending on what you believed. People falling to their knees in the middle of the street, a boy who had been deaf in one ear hearing clearly, a man who had not spoken to his brother in 11 years walking across a field at midnight to knock on his door. Glenys borrowed the train fare from Nesta and went alone on a Thursday morning. She sat in the back of a crowded schoolhouse where the meeting was being held. A local farmer was speaking, not a minister, just a farmer. And he was weeping so freely that he had to stop twice to collect himself. The rooms smelled like winter coats and coal smoke. The floor was uneven. There was no stage, no order of service, no printed program. But the ceiling, Glenys would later write, felt like it was dissolving. She didn't understand what she meant by that when she wrote it. She only knew that something that had been above her, some invisible distance between herself and God, was simply not there anymore. Like a wall that had been standing so long she forgot God it was a wall. And then one morning it was gone. And the light coming through was a different quality of light entirely. She knelt on that uneven floor and did not get up for 3 hours. She came back to Pontypridd a different person. Not dramatically different on the outside, She still went to the mill, she still saved her shillings, she still walked home in the dark, and ate supper with her family. But the internal geography had shifted. Something had been planted that was going to grow, whether or not there was room for it. The years that followed were years of hiddenness. This is the part of these stories that nobody tends to put in the title. The part that isn't dramatic. The long, unseen stretch of preparation that looks, from the outside, exactly like nothing. Glenys did not preach. She did not have a platform. She was a woman in Wales at the turn of the century, and the pathways for women like her were narrow and closely watched. What she did instead was pray and visit. She began going to the homes of the sick, the bereaved, the difficult cases that no one else knew quite how to approach. Not with answers, just with presence and prayer. She would sit with a dying man and not offer theology. She would sit with a woman whose husband had left and not offer advice. She would sit, and she would pray. And something happened in those rooms that she never took credit for, and never could fully explain. A widow in the village told the minister that Glenys had come 3 times in a week, and that after the 3rd visit she had felt something lift off her chest that had been there since her husband died, a weight so familiar she had stopped, noticing it was there. The minister filed this under the category of grateful women and went back to his sermon notes. He did not understand what was being built. Because here is the thing about hiddenness. It is not wasted time. It is the most important time. The work that Rachel Sizalove did alone on a train was more important than the work she did in the tent. The work that Glenys did in those small rooms, unseen, unreported, unapplauded. That was the forge. That was where the thing was being shaped that could not be shaped any other way. She prayed for 15 years before anyone outside her village knew she existed. In 1904, Wales caught fire. The Welsh Revival swept through the country with a force that historians still struggle to categorize, led primarily by a young man named Evan Roberts. It moved through villages and towns and coal fields with a speed and intensity that had no organizational explanation. More than 100,000 people were reported to have made some kind of religious commitment within 8 months. The taverns in certain towns reported dramatic drops in business. Court dockets thinned. Police stations grew quiet. Glenys was 28 years old when it arrived in her county, and she watched it the way she had always watched sacred things. From a position of attentiveness, rather than performance, learning everything she could. She saw the power of corporate prayer. She saw how one person's surrender could create permission for a room to move. She saw things she couldn't explain and refused to over-explain, which was rarer than it sounds. Most people, when they witness something beyond their framework, feel immediate pressure to either dismiss it or make it fit. Glenys had always had the unusual capacity to simply let something be what it was and wait for understanding to come later. She also saw the aftermath. Because revivals are followed by mournings, the fire comes and the fire lifts, and then there is the long work of what to do with the people who were changed by it. She saw young people who had been set ablaze with no idea what to do next, no structure to receive what had happened to them, no one to say, "This is not the end of the story, this is the beginning." That, she understood, was her work. She was 31 when she left Wales, not for a bigger city, not for a prestigious post. She went to a former mining town in Pennsylvania, following a letter from a woman she had never met who had written to a missionary society, asking if anyone knew someone who could help with a situation that was getting beyond them. The situation was a small Pentecostal congregation of about 40 people meeting in a rented hall above a hardware store. Their previous teacher had taken ill and returned to his family. They were, the letter said, like sheep who had been fed and then left in the field. They knew enough to be hungry but not enough to feed themselves. Glenys read that letter 3 times. Then she packed one trunk and bought a ticket. The crossing took 11 days. She arrived in November, in a city she had never seen, in a country she had only read about, with £4 in her possession, and the address of the hardware store written in pencil on the inside cover of her Bible. She found the congregation on a Tuesday night, at a prayer meeting that had been going for 2 hours by the time she arrived. She stood in the doorway in her travel coat, and no one moved to greet her, because everyone in the room was on their knees. She set down her bag and joined them. The congregation was not what she had expected. which is to say it was exactly what she had expected, in the sense that human need always looks the same underneath its particular costume. There was a man named Mr. Howell who was very loud and very certain, and took up enormous amounts of space in every meeting. There was an elderly woman who wept every week at exactly the same point in the service. Whether or not anything had occurred that warranted it. There were young couples who looked frightened and hopeful in equal measure. There were children who ran in the aisles until someone told them not to. And there were the quiet ones. There are always the quiet ones. The people who come every week and sit in the same seat and say very little and feel everything, and go home and live privately with whatever they carry, which is usually much more than anyone suspects. Those were the ones Glenys prayed for the most. She did not come in with a program. She did not arrive with a theological agenda or a 5-step plan for congregational development. She arrived with a question she asked herself every single morning: what is actually needed here? Not what do I have to offer? Not what have I prepared? What is actually, specifically, concretely needed by these people today? It was a harder question than it sounds. It required her to listen more than she spoke. It required her to be wrong sometimes and correct herself without defensiveness. It required her to let other people's hunger become more important than her own plans. She stayed for 3 years. By the end of the 3rd year, the congregation had grown from 40 people to nearly 200. But that was not what mattered. What mattered was the quality of what was growing. These were not people who had been convinced of something. These were people who had been changed. There is a vast difference, and Glenys was unwilling to mistake one for the other. Women who had never prayed aloud were leading prayer. Young men who had worked in the mills their whole lives were visiting the sick with a tenderness that surprised everyone who knew them. A girl of 17 who had come to the congregation as an afterthought, dragged along by her mother, became the kind of intercessor that strong men asked to pray for them before difficult things. This is what gets missed in the counting of numbers. Revival is not primarily about size. It is about depth. It is about whether the thing that is planted goes into the ground far enough to survive the seasons that are coming. Glenys understood the seasons that were coming. She had been paying attention her entire life. There were hard years, a disagreement with a visiting minister who felt she had too much authority for a woman. She did not fight it publicly. She prayed about it privately and continued doing what she understood to be her work. A season in which nothing seemed to move. 3 months in which she went to prayer every morning and felt, as she wrote in her journal, like she was speaking into a bucket. She did not stop. She wrote, "I have learned not to measure faithfulness by feeling. Feeling is a weather report. Faithfulness is the architecture." A death she grieved very deeply. A young man in the congregation who had been one of the most alive people she had ever known, gone suddenly of fever at 24. She sat with his mother for days. She did not offer theology. She sat and she wept, and she let grief be grief without rushing it toward resolution. She wrote very little in her journal during those weeks. What she did write was this: "Sometimes the only thing you can carry for a person isn't the weight with them." I do not know if this is ministry. I think it might be the best kind. In 1912 she returned to Wales, not to stay, to visit, and to bring back with her 2 young women from the congregation who had been asking, for the better part of a year, whether there was somewhere they could receive more training. There was. There was a small residential community that had grown up around a house in Llandrindod Wells, where people came for weeks or months to pray and study, and learn the kind of things that are not taught in classrooms. Glenys had known the woman who ran it for years. She brought her 2 young women there and left them in October, and began the crossing back to Pennsylvania alone. But before she left, she spent a week at the house herself, the first real rest she had taken in years. She slept 10 hours a night. She walked in the hills every morning. She ate slowly and tasted her food, and sat in the evenings without agenda. She was 36 years old. She had been doing the thing she was built for without pause for more than a decade. On the last morning before she left, she sat in the chapel at the house and was quiet for a long time. Then she wrote in her journal, "I have been afraid sometimes that I was spending myself on something too small, that the work was too invisible, too slow, too without visible outcome. I think I was wrong. I think the problem is that I have been measuring it. The work is not mine to measure. It is only mine to do. She closed her journal, put on her coat, and walked to the train station. The remaining decades of her life look from the outside like more of the same, and they were in the best possible sense. She returned to the congregation in Pennsylvania and continued the work. She trained people who went on to do things she never did, reaching places she never went, touching lives she never touched directly. She wrote letters, hundreds of letters, to people she had prayed with who had moved away and needed, periodically, someone who knew their story. She never published anything. She never sought a public platform. She was asked twice, in later life, to speak at larger gatherings, and she did. And those who were there described those meetings in terms that suggested something unusual happened in the room. But she did not build on that. She was suspicious of momentum that came from spectacle. She had seen too many fires go out because someone built a monument on top of them. She kept visiting the sick and the dying. She kept showing up in the small rooms where no one was watching. She kept getting up before dawn to pray when there was no evidence that it was doing anything at all, because she had understood, somewhere in her 30s, a thing that many people spend their entire lives trying to learn and never quite get. The hiddenness is not the preparation for the work. The hiddenness is the work. The invisible hours are the load-bearing walls. The things you do when no one is watching are the things that hold everything else up. She knew that the man who received his healing was not primarily changed by the moment of the prayer. He was changed by the 30 years of accumulated faithfulness in the person praying. She knew that the young woman who found her footing in her faith did not find it because of the sermon she heard. She found it because of the woman who stayed up at 3 a.m, asking God on her behalf, and then never mentioned it. This is the economy of the kingdom, and it runs entirely counter to every other economy the world operates by. It cannot be measured by attendance figures or speaking invitations or the size of your following. It can only be measured by what actually happens in human lives. And even then, you won't see most of it. Most of it will happen after you're gone, in rooms you never entered, through people who were shaped by someone who was shaped by someone you prayed for 20 years ago. Glenys Maud Bevan died in 1951. She was 74 years old. She died in the same 2-room house she had grown up in, having returned to Wales for the last time in 1946 to care for her older sister. She died on a Tuesday in the early morning, which felt appropriate to those who knew her, because that was when she was always awake anyway. The congregation in Pennsylvania held a memorial service. The building was too small for everyone who came. People drove from 3 states. Several of them had never met her personally. They had been prayed for by someone who had been trained by someone who had sat under her teaching. And somehow, across those degrees of separation, they knew that something had reached them that traced back to her. The minister who led the service said only this, by way of eulogy. She was hungry. She stayed hungry, and she fed everyone around her from that hunger without ever once making the meal about herself. There is a theology in that. It is the hardest theology to practice. It requires you to let go of the need to see results, the need to be recognized, the need to know whether what you are doing matters. It requires you to be the kind of person who gets up in the dark and prays into silence and trusts that the silence is not emptiness but fullness that has not yet found its form. We tell these stories at this channel because we believe they are not finished. The people are gone, but the pattern is not. The pattern is still available. The same hunger that drove Glenys to her knees at 9 years old and kept her there for 65 years is accessible to anyone who is willing to want it badly enough. And so the question, the real question, the one that outlasts any story we could tell, is not about her. It is about the invisible hours of your life. What are you doing with them? What are you carrying into the small rooms, the quiet mornings, the unremarkable Tuesdays, when no one is watching and nothing visible is happening, and it would be very easy to put down what you've been given and simply rest? She didn't put it down. Not once. Not for 74 years. That is not a guilt trip. That is an invitation. The fire she carried did not go out when she died. Fire doesn't work that way. It finds something else to burn. The question is whether you are willing to be the something else.